All right, welcome back, everybody, to Get Nisty, the series that breaks compliance out of the checkbox trap and turns it into a real security advantage. No fluff, no FUD, just practical strategies to make compliance work for your MSP. I'm Jared Kasner, and I'm joined by my co-founder of Blacksmith InfoSec and co-host of Get Nisty, Michael Zabarski. Let's jump right in. Mike, do you want to ask our first question?
Sure, Jared. The first question comes from Tony, an MSP based in Denver. I keep hearing people refer to different security frameworks as RMFs. What is an RMF and how is it different than a security framework? So let's start with the basics. RMF stands for Risk Management Framework. All of cybersecurity is managing risk. That's all you need to do. You need to figure out what is the company risk tolerance and how do you align to that, right? So you might have a bank, for example, where the risk tolerance is extremely low, and they will put in layer upon layer upon layer of security. Or you might have a startup where their risk tolerance is much higher because they just need to move fast and a breakneck speed. And so you would have less security controls. They also don't have as much money to spend on security. And so that's really what boils down to and why it's called a risk management framework, because all of it will provide you with guidance of, hey, here's a bunch of things you should be looking at, should be considering, implementing, etc., to reduce overall risk of the organization. And then the reality of it is, in a lot of situations, you're not going to do all of it. You're going to do some of it. And so how do you figure out which controls to put in place, which controls to put in place today versus tomorrow versus next year? And this is all about managing risk. It's the, hey, what do we need to do today? How do we plan for it? What risks do we have? And it flows up throughout the business to organizational risk, right? So it's not going to be just the security pieces. There's going to be other organizational risks that you can look at and say, hey, there's an organizational risk of X. If we implement these controls, we limit that organizational risk. And that risk may not be a security risk. It may not be a compliance risk. It may be a regulatory risk, or it may be a public perception risk. And so again, if the company's worried about website defacement, cool. What can you do from a technical perspective to make sure that doesn't happen? Well, make sure, if you're using WordPress, for example, make sure your WordPress is patched, your plugins are patched, make sure there's multi-factor when you're authenticating into your website, all that stuff.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on a lot of really important topics there, and getting into things like the technical controls is really important. At the same time, if you look at SOC 2 and a lot of the other risk management frameworks that are out there, yes, they're sort of called cybersecurity frameworks, but they include a lot of other governance topics. SOC 2 requires you to be holding regular board meetings and think about how you're onboarding and offboarding users and things like that, right? So it's creating these controls and the mindset that is about reducing risk and lowering your overall risk profile. And so, maybe we can talk a little bit about the non-technical controls for just a minute here. What are some things that, I mentioned board meetings, like why? What's the value of a board meeting?
Yeah, depends who you ask. So no, it's the oversight, right? The board is ultimately responsible for the company in an ideal situation. And so they want to make sure that, first of all, in a lot of situations, they hold the purse strings. And more to the point, they are responsible to make sure the company is successful. And the way to do that is to get the risk aligned to whatever the appetite is. And who sets that risk appetite? It's usually the executive and the board level, where they say, hey, this is the amount of risk that we as executives and the board take on, because at the end of the day, it's their risk. They're responsible for it. And there are a ton of non-security, non-technical controls that people should do. User audits are, a personnel control. making sure that when people are offboarded, they're actually offboarded. So going through on a monthly basis, quarterly, whatever it happens to be, and making sure that the current active users should actually be active. From an accounting standpoint, making sure that when you get an email that says, hey, please change my wiring instructions. Guess what? Don't change the wiring instructions. Don't call the number in the email. Call a known good number. Get in touch with the person in the way that you usually get in touch with them and validate that you should actually be doing this. Same thing for sending wires, right? Make sure there's two people that have to approve any wire over some threshold, right? You probably don't want to bother the CFO for a $1,000 wire, again, depending on the size of the organization, etc. But anything over 10,000, 50,000, whatever that magic number is for your organization, you want to make sure that there's two sign-offs on it. And again,
and that's a really good point, Mike. What makes sense for your organization, because at Bank of America, if somebody's having to sign off on everything over $1,000, guess what? They're going to drive somebody crazy very quickly. At a smaller business, your local dentist practice, if they're allowing the receptionist to sign off on things that are $50,000, well, guess what? Their total monthly cash flow might be $50,000. That, right? Bank of America does that in 10 seconds. Your dentist might do that in a month or 6 months. And so, finding the threshold that makes sense for your business and understanding each client's risk thresholds, right? And you alluded to this when it comes to uptime, how much, or rather downtime, how much downtime are you willing to take on as an organization? How much data loss are you willing to accept as an organization? What's your financial thresholds, right? Having those conversations with your clients and understanding what their needs are is going to really drive a lot of that trust that you need to be able to manage. So forget about the framework for a second here. The frameworks are really just a tool to guide you through that process of asking the right questions. Picking which framework, that's maybe something we could touch on here also. But I mean, I think when we look at the difference between a risk management framework and a security framework, there really is no tangible difference. I am going to just, one thing that sort of popped in my mind is that with NIST, so the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, I can speak, I swear. NIST produces both a cybersecurity framework, or sometimes called CSF, and a risk management framework, RMF. So what is the difference between NIST RMF and NIST CSF for somebody who might be confused and trying to figure out which framework they should be using?
Yeah, so NIST CSF is going to be more tactical, more technical aligned to say, hey, here's the stuff you should be doing as an organization. There's going to be some organizational controls, some direct security controls. And the organizational controls really flow up or down to the security controls, right? Making sure the business understands what their mission is, what their objectives are, because you can't secure what you don't know what you're trying to do. The RMF talks more about overall organizational risk, not just in the cybersecurity form of it. And so there you'll see other things to consider, like, hey, what happens if the building burns down and all of a sudden we have to work remote? Or what happens if there's a pandemic and all of a sudden we all have to work remote? And how do you make that pivot? What are the risks of that? Keyman insurance, or what happens if your CFO wins the lottery and moves to the Bahamas, never to be heard from again? Things like that. So it's just a little bit more wide, organization-wide for the RMF versus the cybersecurity framework that supports that. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess sort of related to all this also, I hear CIS, I hear NIST, SOC 2. There's hundreds of different risk management frameworks or cybersecurity frameworks out there. If I'm a small MSP or have a small client, how do I help them decide what makes the most sense for them? Is it CIS? Is it NIST? Is it something else?
Yeah, so it depends on the client, right? And it's going to depend on the vertical.
I love the it depends answer. That's always so helpful.
It's always, it really much does though, right? It's the if you have a healthcare organization versus a bank, they're going to have different regulatory standards they have to abide by. And so you have to understand the business. If you have a small healthcare organization, they're going to be doing HIPAA. If you have a small care organization is also publicly traded, guess what? You also need to layer in the SEC cybersecurity rule because they're publicly traded. If they're processing credit cards, guess what? You need to layer in PCI. So a lot of it goes to scoping and figuring out what that is, and how to do that. There's lots of different ways, but the first to actually figure out which frameworks apply to it, but to be able to figure out which frameworks apply, you need to understand what the business does. And so again, partnering with the business and figuring out, hey, this is John's dentist shop. Cool. Like, if it's a dentist, it's definitely going to be HIPAA. What else do they do? Oh, they take credit cards. Cool. PCI, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I think at a practical level for an MSP that isn't sure and doesn't know the answer, I would pick either CIS or NIST CSF as a baseline and just build from there, because that's going to give you pretty comprehensive coverage across all of the different aspects or all the different risk management frameworks and regulatory frameworks that somebody might need to be compliant with. And that'll, if you're working towards one of those, you're at least going to be making progress in a way that's going to help you regardless of any regulatory oversight that is required. That buys you time while you're progressing towards either CIS or NIST, CSF, to figure out exactly which regulations are applicable and move things forward towards that. So hopefully, Tony, that clears things up for you. Mike, should I go ahead and read our next question?
Yeah, let's go ahead and tackle it.
Cool. So we actually picked this next one because it flows so nicely from Tony's question. This one comes from Sarah, an MSP consultant in Raleigh. Can you give some real-world examples of how RMF principles, such as user audits and access control, can scale down for small businesses without feeling overwhelming? They seem so bureaucratic and time-consuming, and honestly, time is precious. Well, Sarah, you're exactly right. Time is the ultimate currency. I'm pretty fond of saying time is non-fungible, right? If you work late on a Friday night, you're not getting your Friday night back. There's no way you can get that back. And so that precious non-fungible resource that we have to protect it at all costs. So again, I think that some of this comes back to some of the principles that we were talking about in the last section, which really is understand what level of risk is acceptable to the business. Mike and I have seen this firsthand where when a user audit is not performed, sometimes things get missed in offboarding. Either the client forgets to tell their MSP that the user was offboarded and the user account stay active, or the user account was offboarded in 3 out of 4 systems, but not the 4th. And that causes problems sometimes where all of a sudden you start realizing that somebody has access that they should not have access to anymore. And so, trying to figure out what the right balance is for your organization and understand how to scope that down. Maybe it's an annual user audit instead of a quarterly user audit. Maybe it's protecting how many logins you're allowing somebody to have into different systems, right? And just thinking through who has access to what. But trying to figure out and limit the scope of things will help drive those operational efficiencies so you can stay efficient and can protect your time while also giving people the tools they need to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jared. And you kind of hit the nail on the head. It goes back to risk. And so, if you have systems, you should classify them. Is the system critical, non-critical, right? So if you have people that access a JOT form, for example, and the JOT form is used for collecting lunch orders, if someone's off board and you forget to remove them from there, it's not the end of the world. If it's your accounting system, probably a much bigger deal. And so, again, classify your systems, start with the critical ones, and land and expand model, right? Work your way down through the high, medium, and then eventually to the lows as you mature that security program. The other thing I'll say, Jared, that you kind of touched on a little bit is user lifecycle management is a huge thing. And so, again, anywhere where you can get that off your plate, using things like SCIM for user provisioning and deprovisioning. So when you offboard someone in Azure AD or Google, that it get automatically deprovisioned in these third-party apps is huge and saves you a ton of time, both from a user cleanup standpoint, but also from a just offboarding standpoint. If you don't have to log into 30 systems to offboard someone, that's phenomenal. The second piece is single sign-on. right? If you can enforce single sign-on for all your apps and you deactivate the AD account, guess what? They're not logging in anywhere. So even if you do forget to offboard, they still can't access the system. And then you kind of pick up the offboarding whenever that cycle is when you do your user audits. So again, prioritize your systems, tackle the critical ones first, wherever you can, streamline the process, single sign-on, skim provisioning, user lifecycle management, etc. And then go from there to make sure that you cover all your apps. You should be doing user audits in all of your apps, just a question of how often, right? So the critical apps do monthly, the not so critical ones maybe do an annual sweep, but stay on top of it.
Yep. Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, right? If you're doing a monthly user audit on a critical system, let's say you're a medical practice, for example, and you're doing a monthly user audit to make sure that nobody has access to your EHR that shouldn't have access to your EHR. First of all, that user audit should go pretty quickly, right? Especially if you only have, let's say your corner or local doctor's office or dentist practice, they might only have 5 or 10 users. And so doing that monthly audit and saying, oh, hey, Mike's still in there. We fired him last week. Get him out of there and move things forward, right? See, this time you got fired, Mike. Usually I get fired in these stories. But, when you do these things regularly and it becomes part of your routine, it becomes a lot easier and you can spot the difference very quickly and make sure you're excising accounts. And Mike and I have seen this a number of times in our past lives where somebody was not offboarded and retained information or retained access to sensitive information that they should not have had access to. I've seen it lead to lawsuits. I've seen it lead to hurt feelings. I've seen it lead to all kinds of problems when you don't take care of this stuff. And so I'm not telling you that to scare you. I'm telling you 5 minutes and just put a calendar invite on a reminder for the first of the month or the first Monday of the month or the last Friday of the month or something to just go through and spend 30 minutes looking at your critical systems. Let's say you have 5 critical systems, maybe you do, or 6 critical systems, maybe you do 2 a month. So that way you're hitting everything every quarter and kind of move things forward, right? So there's different ways that you can do around that or work around that. Mike talked about single sign-on and skim. Well, unfortunately, not every small business friendly or at least small business plan friendly SaaS application allows for things like SSO and skim. But think about that as you're evaluating. If you've got a choice between 2 very similar products, the pricing is very similar, but one of them offers either enforced single sign-on, and I say enforced very, very clearly here, right? Just because they have it, if you don't enforce it, then people could still get in other ways, right? So you want to make sure that you're enforcing the single sign-on or having some sort of skim integration for automatic user provisioning. And Mike, you did date yourself talking about Azure AD. It's Entra now, right? So keep up with the times, bro.
Yeah, it's actually identity now.
Is it identity now? Man, can I change it again? All right, so I'm the one who's out of date too. So in any event, looking for these things can certainly help out. The other thing that I thought was cool, I had a past employer, and I'm in Silicon Valley, and so every once in a while, the perks are sort of silly. But there was a perk that we had that allowed you to take a lift, but they had the company paid for, but the radius that they would allow you to access was the trip had to either originate or end at the company office, and was only valid for like a mile and a half around it. So you could, if you were going from the train station to get to the office, you could take a lift to get there and save yourself some time, which was great. They forgot to deprovision my account when I left, but then the only thing I could do was get to the office, which was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and so it didn't really help me at all that they hadn't deprovisioned my Lyft account. And so looking for those other controls within things so that, if you miss the user audit, it's still not the end of the world, right? So there are ways that you can control and scope. You're going to hear that word a lot from us. Looking for those scope or the scoping options that help you mitigate disaster in the event of, oops, I forgot, will make your life a lot easier.
Yeah. I think that covers a few examples pretty well. Sorry, Sarah, if you have more follow-up questions, obviously please reach out. But feel free to send us any follow-up questions. We can dive deeper into these topics. Jared, how should people reach out if they have any other questions they want answered?
Great question. Head on over to blacksmithinfosec.com/ask. Thanks for joining us today, and tune in next week for more practical advice on compliance.
Get nifty.